Hello and welcome. Welcome to episode 3, What is happening when pain persists? Now, today's episode represents a shift away from information that people might have been a bit more familiar with. It's going to use the information from the first 2 episodes as a foundation and a launchpad into what happens when pain does not follow the normal rules that we described in episode 1. And why, when we search for answers through the likes of scans and x-rays, often we don't get the definitive answer that we thought we might. Now, how do we compute when we have pain in a part of our body and the scan comes back normal? Or worse, what happens when we get a scan result or an answer that is inaccurate? So to set the scene, in episode 1 we talked about normal pain. Pain is a protective output from the brain. The body sends information up through the nerves in the body, through the spinal cord and to the brain. Pain is the brain deciding that you need protection. And most of the time that makes sense. You get an injury, there's damage or a real threat of damage. Pain increases to let you know of this damage, and as the tissue heals, pain usually comes down. And eventually, once healing has taken place, those danger messages from the brain settle. And that is what we think of as normal pain. But a lot of people experience something very different. Their pain carries on beyond the time we would expect tissues to heal, or it improves, but it never fully resolves, or it becomes unpredictable, erratic, variable. When pain doesn't follow the expected healing patterns, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty can be one of the strongest amplifiers of pain-related fear and distress. Now, this episode is going to deal with what happens when pain persists. What do we know about it, and how do we find this out? And what changes occur in the brain and the body when pain starts to persist? Now, it is very important to note, however, that persistent pain is still real pain. So if somebody feels pain, the brain is producing that message of pain. It's not imagined. It may not follow the normal pattern related to damage as we discussed, but pain cannot be made up, and this is a very, very important concept. Despite this, we'll discuss how sometimes pain stops being a good indicator of damage and it becomes more of an indicator of sensitivity or protection. And at times the brain will act in a way that appears counterintuitive to what we discussed previously and why this is. Now, in this episode, we're going to try and dig into the science behind what happens when pain persists and what changes. Now, I have broken this episode up into several slightly shorter episodes as there is a lot of information, and I want to make sure that it's not too heavy and that people can take all the relevant parts in. Now, before we go any further, one safety point. Some conditions genuinely worsen or progress over time. So, for example, inflammatory arthritis, such as rheumatoid arthritis, or certain neurological conditions, or what we'd term invasive forms of osteoarthritis that cause ongoing joint damage and steadily worsening symptoms. Those problems follow different biological rules. They are not what this episode is about. This is not the type of pain we are talking about. In those situations, pain can persist because the underlying problem is still active. Today we're talking about everyday joint, muscle and spinal pain that should be improving, but it doesn't. So let's jump straight in. So what do we actually mean when we say persistent pain? So in simple terms, we mean pain that lasts longer than we would normally expect it to take for tissues to heal. So for many muscles, ligaments and bones, healing happens over weeks to a few months. It's not exact and it does vary from person to person and from injury to injury, but broadly speaking, most tissues repair within 8 to 12 weeks. Now, because of that, international pain organisations now define chronic pain as pain that lasts longer than 3 months. Now, that 3-month mark isn't magical, okay? So it's not a switch that flips overnight. It's simply a practical line in the sand. So if pain still persists beyond that expected healing time, the thought process is that there could be something else that's driving it. Now, at this point, we need to introduce the term chronic pain. And this is important because out there are certain connotations that are associated with the words chronic pain. Some people hear the words chronic pain and think it means permanent. Others might hear it and they feel dismissed, almost like their pain has now been downgraded, like it's been quietly reclassified as something less serious or less important, or not quite real. Now, for some people, once the word chronic appears in their notes, it can feel like the search for a real explanation for their symptoms has stopped, like the doors now have started closing, instead of ongoing investigations. And that stigma does exist, and it does matter, because chronic pain does not mean your pain is imagined, and it does not mean that you're broken beyond repair, and it doesn't mean that your pain is less important than any other type of pain. It means that your nervous system is still producing pain, even though the original injury may have healed. So that pain is real and it is experienced in the body. So when I use the term chronic pain in this episode and in future episodes, I'm not using it as a label. I'm using it in a very simple technical way. I mean pain that has lasted beyond the time we would normally expect tissues to have healed. Nothing more than that. And if someone feels pain, that pain is real. The brain must be producing it. Even if the pattern doesn't make sense, and even if scans are normal, even if clinicians struggle to label it, pain cannot be imagined into existence. If it's felt, it's being generated by the nervous system. And as stated before, in normal pain, the level of pain tends to reflect what is happening in the tissue. So you strain a muscle, it hurts, and as it heals, it hurts less. There's a pattern, there's a timeline. In chronic pain, that link starts to loosen. So the tissue may have healed, but the pain doesn't settle. And the scan may look relatively normal, but the pain remains. Basically, the timeline stops making sense. Now, at that point, pain is less about ongoing damage and more about how sensitive the nervous system has become to the previous damage. And here's the shift away from normal. So what I want to do is I want to look at what we know so far about what is actually happening in the brain and in the body to account for this shift. Now, unfortunately, for a long time in healthcare, pain was viewed almost entirely through a physical lens. So if you had a pain, the assumption was simple: something must be damaged. So when people are presented with ongoing pain and no clear tissue injury, or pain that was far worse than would have been expected, it created a problem. There was no good explanation that could be given to the patient. And when medicine doesn't have a proper explanation, the default can be very, very uncomfortable. People were told it was in their head, that they were exaggerating, that nothing serious was wrong. And all this was based on the fact that there was no known answer at the time. So it wasn't because clinicians were being cruel, but it was because the model that they followed was limited at that point in time. Now, the next part is really, I suppose, the turning point. And this is the piece that reshaped how we think about chronic pain. Basically, two important things happened. So, firstly, researchers began noticing consistently inconsistent patterns. And what I mean by that was they started to notice that some people had severe life-limiting pain with very little tissue damage on scans, whilst others had major tissue damage on scans and had surprisingly very little pain. So people with similar injuries could have completely different pain experiences. Now, this alone challenged the long-held idea that pain was simply a direct readout of how damaged the body was. And this is what we discussed in episode 2, where the picture doesn't always correlate with the symptoms. It suggested that something else must be influencing pain, and this led to the next change. So basically, brain imaging techniques improved. So scientists developed ways of looking at brain activity in real time. So not just as a picture of the actual brain or the structure itself, but what parts of the brain were more active at any given time. And what these are called functional MRI scans. Now, they work by detecting changes in blood flow and oxygen levels in different parts of the brain. So when an area of the brain is working harder, it uses more energy and it receives more blood, and the scanner can basically pick this up. So for example, right now, you're listening to the podcast, and the parts of your brain that are involved in hearing or processing sound, they would show higher activity than usual, and that would infer that you're listening. So when researchers looked at people with chronic pain, they wanted to get a better idea of what was actually happening in their brain at any period of time, and they saw something striking. Areas of the brain known to be involved in pain, threat or emotion were more active than expected, sometimes even when the person was completely at rest, and other times in response to a very light stimulation. So in other words, the pain system appeared to be switched on more easily and more often, even at times when the person was doing nothing. Now, this was extremely important because it showed that in chronic pain, the nervous system itself was behaving differently to what we described in episode 1. And although it sounds obvious, it was the first definitive proof that patients were still actually feeling pain, even if they had no obvious physical reason to. Now, around the same time, researchers discovered something else. When pain is short-lived and settles as tissues heal, the nervous system generally returns to baseline. And what we mean by baseline is as the damage heals, the pain stops. But when the pain continues for long periods of time, as in chronic pain, what we're describing, or where pain keeps flaring up without fully settling, the nervous system doesn't just stay neutral. It doesn't just act the same. It starts to adapt. So in episode 1, we talked about how the brain receives information from the body and then decides whether to produce pain. Well, the nerve cells involved in that process can change with ongoing exposure to pain. So when pain keeps happening over time, those nerve cells can start to react more quickly. They can start to react more strongly. And once switched on, they can stay active for longer than they used to. Now, these are the nerves in the brain that we spoke about that process this information that comes from the body. So this was a key point. It's not that normal pain automatically created this change. It was that prolonged, unresolved pain and ongoing threat can train the nervous system to become better at producing pain. Not because you're choosing to, and not because it was imagined, but because the nervous system is capable of learning. Now, over time, that learning can mean that pain is triggered way more easily, even when the original injury has settled. And the best way of thinking of this example is to think of like a sniffer dog being trained to detect a specific scent. Now, at the start, the dog might only react when the smell is very, very strong. But over time, with repeated exposure and training, the dog becomes better and better at detecting that same scent. And eventually, it'll react to extremely small traces that most of us would never even notice. The smell is the same, but the detection system has become more sensitive through learning. Pain can behave in a similar way by becoming more sensitive even to small stimulus, both physical and emotional. Now, this change is called central sensitization. It's effectively the central nervous system becoming more sensitive, and that's the nervous system within your brain itself. Now, central sensitization helps explain something that confused medicine for decades. You can have ongoing pain without ongoing tissue damage. And you can have pain that is driven mainly by how this processing center in the brain is processing the information rather than by what is actually happening in the tissues themselves. Now, this was a major shift. It didn't mean that tissue damage didn't matter. It meant that tissues are not the whole story. And most importantly, it provided scientific validation for millions of people who've been living with pain that had no good explanation. Their pain was real. There was biology behind it. The model simply had been incomplete prior to this. So when you put all of that together, a simple picture starts to form. Researchers noticed that pain did not always match damage. Brain imaging showed that the pain system can stay more active than normal, and laboratory studies show that nerves involved in pain can become easier to trigger over time and slower to switch off, and they can basically adapt and learn as they're exposed to pain repeatedly. Now, most of us have heard of the condition of fibromyalgia. This is something that we will discuss in more detail in later episodes, but fibromyalgia is probably one of the most widely recognised examples of chronic pain, and pain where no clear tissue damage can be identified. And because of that, a large amount of chronic pain research has involved patients with this condition. Now, in this research, we were led to one more important piece of the story. For years, conditions like fibromyalgia were dismissed because scans didn't show any joint damage, for instance. But more recent research has shown that in a significant proportion of people with fibromyalgia, there are actually measurable changes in the small fibres in the skin as well. Now, these small fibres are involved in sensing pain, temperature, and when they're abnormal, people can experience burning pain, tingling, and heightened sensitivity even without any visible tissue damage. Now, this does not explain every case of fibromyalgia, and it doesn't mean that fibromyalgia is simply a nerve condition, but it does show something important. Chronic pain is not just an idea or a theory about the brain. In some people, there are measurable biological changes in the outer nerves as well. Now, we don't know why this happens, but it appears to be an adaptation from the body to pain for prolonged periods. The nervous system is one connected system from the skin to the spinal cord to the brain. And in chronic pain, changes can occur at more than one level. Now, we don't have the exact time point where all these changes suddenly appear, but research would suggest that they tend to develop when pain has been present for months, not days. So in other words, these changes are associated with pain that doesn't settle, rather than normal short-term pain that say we would be used to. Now, when we consider all of this information, it points to the same conclusion. In many people with chronic pain, the main problem is not that tissues are still being injured. The main problem is that the nervous system has become more sensitive. And that sensitivity means the body can produce pain in response to things that are not dangerous. So, for example, normal movement can hurt, or light touch can hurt. Sitting, standing, or bending can hurt. All these activities that normally wouldn't cause any damage at all to tissue and therefore wouldn't cause any pain, all of a sudden these can hurt. Not because we're actually damaging anything, but because the system is designed to protect you and has learned to overreact. So for people with chronic pain, this is important. It means your pain is real, it means there is biology to back it up, and it means that ongoing pain does not automatically mean your body's falling apart. Sometimes it means that the volume knob on the pain system has been turned up, and that's a very different problem to solve. So to summarise, what we've really done in this episode is a step back from the idea that pain is always a direct readout of what is happening in the tissues. We've looked at how understanding of pain began to change, and from a simple damage model to a broader view that includes the nervous system itself. And that shift changed everything. It gave a biological explanation for pain that had previously been labelled as unexplained. But it also confirmed something very important. Ongoing pain can exist without ongoing injury. And that discovery validated the experience for millions of people living with ongoing pain. But it also opened up a much bigger question. Why? Why does this happen in some people and not in others? So the research started to look at the why. So now that we have a better understanding of what the brain and the nervous system can do, the question is, why would it do it? Why would a system that is so accurate at detecting damage all of a sudden malfunction? And what factors within us can influence this? And that's what we're going to delve into in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and we'll chat soon.